So just a reminder, folks, that what I say is important, but nowhere near as important as what you hear yourself say to yourself, and then who you decide to be and what you decide to do next. And we're going to look at that at the end of tonight's story, or today's story for you guys, and tonight for me. And this is the first time I've actually shared this whole story. I hope you find it valuable. I was raised in the Christian religion via the Churches of Christ denomination. So church, mornings, evenings, Sunday school in the middle, Bible study groups, you name it, they were very part of my young and teenage years. I'm just going to let Peter in. And so there were many rules, I have to tell you, in those days. One of the rules was not being able to play sport on Sundays, which may have curtailed a possible future playing sports, but that's another story I might share with you one time. G'day, Peter. We've begun because we're recording.
Okay, sorry guys. Yep.
And I've just told the first little bit of the story. You'll catch up on it. Good. I was baptized by full immersion, which was one of the rules of the Church of Christ where I was raised. I was 16 years old at the time. What quickly followed was playing and singing for a Christian band. And almost every weekend for about 2 years, we played at a church or a Christian event somewhere in Victoria, which is my home base. It was also the beginning of what was a short storytelling career as a lay preacher, which followed in the tradition of my father and also my grandfather's. I also played rhythm and bass guitar and sang vocals in one of Australia's first Christian rock bands. We were called Harvey Tucker. I don't quite remember what the name meant, but at our very first concert in Her Majesty's Theatre in my hometown of Ballarat, there were many older conservative Christians who walked out because they believed we were too loud, and a lot of people said, we must be of the devil. In this period of time, I also began my corporate career. I began in the financial services industry, and initially I was a credit officer collecting debts, basically. I met many people from the church in business, and I became increasingly surprised at their lack of integrity, their lack of ethics, and their often lack of moral fibre. I began to call this the faith behaviour gap, because I'd read in my studies words reportedly said by the Apostle Peter that faith without works is dead. Later, I was to broaden this to what I now call the values behaviour gap. And of course, as you guys know, that's become one of the great challenges in business, but also in politics. In fact, everything to do in the industrialised world, including religion. It was the first seed, most likely, for what's become my life's work, which is about helping people to excel in business without compromising your personal values. Now, back in those days, as a young guy, I read the Bible from beginning to end many times. I was fascinated then, around age 17, at the differences and often the juxtaposition between the words that were attributed to Jesus, which tallies up at about 6 A4 pages or 2,000 words, and the rest of the book. I began to see that there was a stark difference between faith and religion, and this fact is missing in most people's hearts and minds. But at age 18, I was on a very serious path to become ordained. The faith behaviour gap took its toll, however, and then I got a promotion in business, which meant the family, we moved away. There was a subsequent move back, and then a couple of years later, another move, and it all conspired, and we left the church and we focused on business. I have to tell you, though, that my interest in the vast differences between faith and religion continued. And over the next 25 years, I undertook a major study of all the world's major religions, the major faiths, the major ways of being. I also began what is now still an abiding interest. I got very interested in philosophy, particularly from the 1450s through to the Industrial Revolution, and how the Industrial Revolution dehumanized our lives and continues to do so. Fast forward to age 30, I had somewhat of a midlife crisis. I abandoned my corporate career, and my wife and I, we ended up part owning a general store in the Barossa Valley here in Australia. The plan was Carol would work in the store and I would occasionally, yet my main focus was I was going to become a management consultant. But anyway, very early on, Carol hurt her back. She couldn't work in the store, and I ended up being full-time in the store. And I've got to tell you, ladies and gentlemen, I was probably the worst shopkeeper in history. And so it quickly died a death. And I was back in the corporate world. Not too long, I also was back in the church. This time I had a stint with the Uniting Church, a different denomination, different rules, same game. I returned to playing music and lay preaching, including this time I did a course where I became an accredited lay preacher within the Uniting Church. But the faith behaviour gap, it still remained. I was still meeting religious people in business with no integrity or ethics. I did meet some in those years who didn't have the faith behaviour gap, and yet their ideology seemed to consume their lives. They were the people that believed their way was the only way. Now, ironically, I was meeting the same people in business. I had a lot of bosses who believed that their ways was the only way. But the difference between faith and religion became even starker, and I became once again disillusioned. And then during a theology class in a topic called hermeneutics, I heard a little sentence that came from the mythologist Joseph Campbell, whose work I'd not seen before. And soon after that, Carol and I watched the Power of Myth series where he was interviewed by Bill Moores. Some of you I know have seen it. I read Joseph's book, Hero of a Thousand Faces. I read all of his books on mythology. I think there's 10 books in all. Oh. And through them, I learned that there is absolutely not one original idea in any religion. Not one. They've all been stolen from the ancient and indigenous traditions. The Australian First Nations people, for example, they've got a flood story that predates the Noah story by several thousand years. There are many virgin birth stories, for example, and there are zillions of stories about gods becoming humans. So Jesus wasn't the first, if he actually existed, because there's a lot of doubt about that. For me, my own personal discoveries were that the idea of an external masculine father figure God was extremely unlikely. More likely, it was a man invention, a patriarchal invention to keep people under control. And for the first 1565 years of the church, until Martin Luther came along, that was the case, because it was just the Catholic Church for those first 1500 years. And the only people that could actually teach were the priests who spoke Latin. And if you try to do anything different, like for example, the first guy that translated the Bible into English, he got burnt at the stake for his troubles. Anyhow, fast forward 35 years. My lessons from my experience now are, we're not our jobs, we're not our roles, we're not our beliefs, we're not our ideologies either. And we must hold our beliefs and our ideologies lightly, which is what we've explored together in this group. We do have an essence, however, a unique personal wisdom. And from this essence, we have preferences into how we live, learn, and lead. And we're going to look at some of those preferences this evening, or today for you guys. Joseph Campbell called essence bliss, and he coined a wonderful phrase, follow your bliss. He thought it was the key to living your best one-of-a-kind life, and I would agree 100% with him. We decide, after learning what our essence is, who we must be and what we can't not do, which is Joseph Campbell's explanation of what bliss actually is, what we can't not do. And today we'll look at these 9 possible preferences that I've sent you in the playbook. I call them the 9 wisdom worlds of wise leaders. But studying Joseph Campbell's work, it's an ongoing passion. It initially awakened my curiosity at a very deep level. And I have to tell you, folks, I've stayed curious. Of course, we've been exploring bliss or essence in this We Need to Talk program this workshop. You might prefer a different term to essence or bliss. You might call it nature, song, quiddity, element, voice, vitality, gift. The Japanese call it ikigai. There's lots of different ways of looking at it. But what's happened for me is, inspired by the work of Joseph Campbell, yet treading my own path, I've endeavoured to shine a light of inspiration for people on the infinite possibilities through telling stories. And I'm grateful to you guys that you've helped me to enhance the storytelling experience. We see through the ancient myths, and I'll just share with you a couple of books. I know, Richard, I was trying to find my copy of it, but not too sure what I did with it. But the Bluegrass book that you recommended, this is a wonderful one. It's called Songlines. This is about the Aboriginal stories. Wonderful book. A really terrific book is this Sand Took, which is also about the Australian Aborigines and how they tell stories. There's lots of wonderful books out there now about this whole idea that we don't need to know the details when we hear stories, because the wisdom is embedded in the story. And it'll be available to us in the moment when we need it. You don't need to understand until you need to understand. That's my lesson from studying all these books. And there are, as I say, many great works available. There are lessons and reasons, and this is why I say what I say is important, yet nowhere near as important as what you hear yourself say to yourself, and what you become, who you become, and what you do next. So today, what are you hearing yourself say to yourself?
Okay, is that an open question, Ian?
Very open question, yes.
What really struck me, I mean, right just towards the end of what you were saying there, one of the things that's been on my mind for a while now is that we start in the wrong place quite often with questions. We access questions too easily. We access sort of the questions that are available to us, which I think are often predetermined by what's going on right that minute. And the point that hit me when you were talking about stories was, it's another angle, another lens on something I've been thinking, which is you need quiet space. The question you need won't come out of logic. It won't come out of effort.
No.
It's got to have space to arrive. And
I think it was Pascal who said something about sitting in a room and waiting.
Yeah, and I think it is that, and it just struck me that really there were two things that came from the story. One was the number of people who have values as an aspiration rather than a practice, and I'm juxtaposing sort of values and faith for a minute. Just it's a bit crude.
Yes, as I was doing.
Yeah, and stories as a guide to the questions we need. So what I really liked about the story that you were just telling was for me, was the questions that emerged for it that would not have emerged had you not been telling the story.
Wonderful. I think that's a great insight to stories in general. Yeah. And it's why I've loved it. My latest read has been Songlines, which of course is another word for the dreaming, the original word dreaming. It's just a wonderful insight, because for the Indigenous folk, and this is true of the Native American Indians, it's true of every Indigenous tribe that I've looked at, the Incas, anyone you look at, they have a incredible sense of place. They can tell a story about things that happened in the place from way back that are now important. Anyhow, Claudia, I know you've got to go shortly. So what are you hearing yourself say to yourself?
I think it's just regularly, first of all, I want to say I love what Richard was just saying, that stories are a guide to the questions we need. this is so cool. I don't know, I think just a little bit popped up also my disillusion or disappointment with in the working world, business companies, that we encounter so many times this lack of appreciation, ethics, integrity. And when you were telling your story and mentioning these points, I just little brief reminders popped up that we constantly encounter that, and how hard it seems to change that.
I do think it's got better than what it was.
I thought it got better because I read about companies, maybe because I'm reading about companies who bring in the human factor and really work with the employees, and there's different, less hierarchy and so on. But just last week, I had a conversation with one of our participants from my photo workshop, who was telling his story, how he was dedicated with passion and interest to his work. And he's a physicist, physics. And then after 20 years, he helped building up internationally offices, he built up a team, and so on and so on. He got sick at some point. Okay, he had to take some weeks off or a couple months. But then eventually he basically just got kicked out with no appreciation for whatever he has done, not recognizing all the work he has contributed, and so on, and said, oh my God, here again. So those stories pop up all the time. So I feel like, is it getting better? I'm not sure.
Yeah, look, my experience, I'm sure you others, I've got 2 peer groups, and in those groups that they're all working for organizations that have experienced in one way or another transformational change. And a lot of them have actually, since they've been in the peer groups, they've actually left the organizations that weren't and have joined ones who are. And that's, of course, what's going on in the world at the moment. A lot more people leaving their jobs than ever before. And I think that's going to continue for a while. You know, we have this huge gap between what's possible and reality. The worst of humans is being shown in Ukraine right now, and other places, as dictators and authoritarian rulers try to, you know, take us down a fascist path. That's the ugliness of humanity. But at the same time, there are a lot of wonderful things happening in the world, and even inside Ukraine, there's been some wonderful humanitarian stories that are coming out of there. And I think, in the end, the truth wins. And I haven't lost any of my optimism, despite, you know, some of the challenges. And I'm encouraged every day. I'm encouraged, you know, to be in the room with people like you, because you're on the path. You're doing the work. Otherwise, you wouldn't be here. And I find that incredibly encouraging. I've been fortunate to be part of Richard's new artisans group, where I got the same feel. I'm in the room with folks who are doing the bloody work. And it's encouraging. And in my case, I'm so encouraged and curious and feel so good about it. I get up at 5 o'clock in the morning to join in, because it's that good.
Hero work.
And so I'm encouraged by, I'm disappointed, I'm saddened, I feel pain in my heart over Ukraine and a whole bunch of other things. But the other side of me is optimistic and in awe of what we're capable of. All right, Liviu, Peter, because I'd like to try and capture this in this little recording before Claudia goes. So, Liviu, what did you?
Be short if you don't mind.
You can
For me, what
short or long, whichever you want.
What came as what I heard myself, hearing myself, speaking to myself, was the fact that we should question everything, always. It's so easy to jump to conclusions, including the narratives in Ukraine, because there is not just one side that, let's say, holds the whole truth.
No,
And
Agreed.
the media is just, I won't go there.
there's a
So
lot of.
let's say just question everything.
I'll say it. There's a lot of people behaving badly in Ukraine too.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's the reality.
And I've been there myself in terms of realizing that, we're not being given the whole picture, and I refuse to just accept the, propaganda from any side in anything. The old saying that the truth is the first casualty in war applies, I think. Yeah.
So Liviu, question everything always. What a wonderful insight.
Yeah.
And this will
Anything
be
else,
followed
Liviu?
by trying to find the truth, which is not easy,
Yeah.
especially in the times we live in. Because questioning without making an effort to find what is true is not enough.
One of the fascinating stories in the Bible is in the supposed trial of Jesus Christ. The governor Pilate asked Christ a question: "What is truth?" And he didn't get an answer, depending on which text you read. And I still think it's a bit like that, isn't it? We're all asking what is truth, and often we don't get an answer. And I think this is why what Richard was saying earlier in that Pascal quote, which I can't quite get, but often we just got to sit in a room alone and wait.
I'm reminded about the work of David R. Hawkins, who wrote Power versus Force, in which he presents a method of, let's say, testing beliefs. But what's most fascinating for me is the fact that truth is actually directly related to one's level of, let's say, spiritual development. And those that were, let's say, more like saints, they achieve a higher level of truth than others.
Yes.
For example, Gandhi.
Yes. One of the great teachings of Buddhism, which is one of my favorite insights, the whole idea behind Buddhism and the Noble Truths, the whole idea is to, and one of the Zen monks that I've read a bit about, he says, the purpose of Buddhism is to find the inner Buddha. And I reckon that's kind of what you're on about.
Yeah.
And the word Buddha, the origin of the word is to awaken, or to be awake.
Yes.
Yeah.
And of course, Gandhi said, be the change you want to see.
Yeah. And Carl Jung said, he who looks outside dreams, he who looks inside awakens. So, if we want to find the solution to the problems we see in the world, which is back to Gandhi saying, you look within.
Yes. And of course,
see,
that's the message, of course, of Peter, of philosophy, psychology, ecology, mythology.
Yeah.
And this is why, of course, the idea of an external God is such a silly idea, because it's inside.
It's inside. Yeah.
It has to be.
Yeah. And it was that T.S. Eliot thing, when you go out and exploring, you come back and know the place for the first time.
Yeah.
That's returning to your essence, because it was what you were looking for was there all along.
Yes.
You just thought you went out to find it. And actually, just on that point, I mean, I listen to Alan Watts every day. I can't believe how many hundreds of hours of recordings there are of Alan Watts.
Yes.
Talking, a guy who died half a century ago.
Yes.
He's one of the great thinkers of the 20th century, I think. And
yes,
one of the things he talks about is we describe our society, Western society or American society, as materialist. And he said that's actually completely wrong. We actually are obsessed with the abstract, the chasing after the dollar, which is an abstract concept. He said back in his time, he said they brought in a law, in America to make, burning the flag a crime. And he said the big joke is that we're burning up the country, the physical landscape. We are destroying the land. But burning an abstract symbol is a crime, and he said we are actually, we are unmaterialistic. And I'm just thinking back to your thing about, the Native Americans, Native Australians have a sense of place. They don't think of themselves as owning the land. They think of themselves as part of the land. It's who they are. It is their essence. And
yes, and the idea of destroying the land or nature is completely abhorrent to all Indigenous folk.
Well, it's insane because it's like destroying yourself. That's the whole point. And
that's the point.
That's
I
why
need to go. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Thank you
nice
for joining
to see
us,
you,
Claudia.
Claudia.
We'll see you next time.
Nice seeing you, Claudia.
Bye.
Bye.
So Peter,
that's
anything in particular that you heard yourself say to yourself?
Well, it just simply reinforced some things that I'd already kind of reflected on. In mythology, there's a quote, I think Marianne Williamson once said, just because it didn't happen doesn't mean it isn't true. That's the power of mythology. People say, well, did Jesus even exist? Well, it doesn't matter whether Jesus existed or not.
True.
The story of who he was and what he was about is what is true.
Yes.
So I think that's a really powerful distinction. Just because it didn't happen doesn't mean it isn't true.
No.
The other thing was the whole thing around principles and values, and living them. And you might remember from my 60 lessons, number 14, your judgment of others will return to judge you. And my dad left the church because he saw their behavior as being completely at odds with what, the principles and values of Christianity were.
Yes.
And he just left the church because he was disgusted by the behavior he saw.
And yet the central teaching of all religions and philosophies and ways to live, the central teaching is that we need to love one another.
Yeah, exactly. And the irony, that was my lesson. The irony is my dad years later wanted to go to the Christmas, service at church, and he said, I can't go. And I said, why not? And he said, because I used to judge the people who came once a year. So so he basically was living out that principle from, Christianity, or, Jesus said, don't judge lest you be judged yourself. And it's a psychological principle of, your own judgments will come back at you eventually. So no, I loved hearing your story. I didn't know all that stuff about you. And
no, it's the first time you missed the sort of early bit, but it's the first time I've actually shared this sort of whole bit. I've shared bits of it before, but I thought it was time.
Yeah, no, it's a powerful story. I'm sorry I missed the beginning. So yes, it's really, really interesting. So thank you.
So you're welcome. And I might sort of continue the recording on just a little bit, just to give folks maybe an insight to the sort of conversation, because I put it out to you in the playbook, and I'm just going to, this is on page 17 of the playbook. And for folks that are watching this, I'll put a link to it so you can see the model. I call these the living, learning, and leading preferences. And
is this something you've just developed yourself, Ian, over time?
Yeah, it's taken about 40 years, Peter. It was heavily influenced by Joseph Campbell's Hero's Journey originally, and then Glenn Capelli's model into, he calls them the lands of smarts. And I didn't really piece it together until a few months ago. Lying in a hospital bed was when it all became clear. And then I workshopped it with Glenn, who was happy for me to build on some of his insights. And what you see now is that model. And it
relates a little bit to is it seven different intelligences? I can't remember who.
Yeah, it is also built on Howard Gardner's work. He's gone on a bit from there. I went for 9 because I discovered that the magical numbers in the world are 3, 6, and 9.
Yeah, and
that's another story that we might look at sometime. But they're magical numbers in mathematics.
Yes,
particularly 9. 9 is the secret number.
Yes,
so that's another story. We may touch on it later. But so I went for the 9, and page 17 gives a summary. And I guess just what I'm asking you to do, because I think it helps us when we know our essence and we can describe it in a sentence. And you may or may not be there yet. But when you know your essence or your unique personal wisdom and you're able to express it in a sentence, it then becomes about preferences. And so I've just summarized them, and then I've suggested on page 18 that you might look at choosing some music, because I found music a very interesting way. And when I was in hospital, because I had to lay still for a bit, I listened to Spotify on my phone with the headphones in. That's where I come up with my 9 songs. So it was one song for each of the 9 areas. And you may or may not like that exercise, but I found it interesting to put words and language and music to my feelings. I found it a useful exercise. But I thought tonight we just might explore, when you see that, when you see the 9, what comes up for you? What do you hear yourself say to yourself? What rings a bell? What does it tell you about your own essence, perhaps? What are your preferences?
Yeah, I was looking at it last night, and I there was quite a number of them I liked, running from sort of reflective round to peer groups. But when I was forced to choose one, I went for stories and conversations. And many years ago, someone wrote a testimonial for me as a speaker and said, I would describe Peter as a storyteller. And my negative mindset went straight to that's a negative thing, which was really bizarre, because I love stories. I love hearing other people's stories. That's what I love, about what you do, Ian. But I thought, I'm not a proper speaker because I'm telling stories. It's like, which is like that Brené Brown thing and Power of Vulnerability, when,
Yes.
Speaker Booker suggested, calling her a storyteller, and she was insulted by that, which is crazy.
It is crazy, because, it's the thread. If you look at, and again,
Yeah.
Look at all the religions, all the philosophies, all the ways of life, the proponents were all great storytellers.
Yeah.
I went back to Cicero, and, he was probably one of the first public speakers. You go back in politics, I went back about 7,000 years in politics, and there were some wonderful people back in those very early days, but all great storytellers.
Yeah.
And of course, at the heart of every Indigenous culture,
Stories.
And
they get transmitted more effectively. They had no way of writing things down, so that the oral traditions was the way it passed on.
And what this book Songlines teaches is the rigor that goes into making sure that of the accuracy of what's passed down, and how that's relived in ceremony and music as well, for most of the Indigenous people. And so the various chants and songs, and hence the word songlines.
Yeah.
Fascinating. All right, Richard, Liviu, and of course, you have preferences in all of these areas. I just think at certain times in our lives, we have one that kind of is our focus for the moment. Richard, what's come up for you?
Well, I was looking at it, Ian, and what struck me with it was that, and what came to the fore a couple of years ago, I did a lot of work on archetypes with Richard Olivier, based around mythodrama.
Yes, yeah.
The idea that we evoke archetypes. We have all the archetypes within us.
Yes.
And depending on the situation we're in, we evoke the archetypes that we need.
Yes.
And I was looking at that, so I was looking at it and scribbling around. I sort of got 4 of them, and what struck me was I'd circled sort of stories and conversations, language, visual, and reflective. If I was going for one, it would be reflective. But it's a sort of close call because they're all interlinked.
Yeah, of course.
And
interesting thing, Richard, and you'd know this, the archetypes, of course, Jung did a lot of work in archetypes. Many psychologists have done work in things, but for the Indigenous people, they refer to their ancestors.
Yes.
Which in many ways, of course, are archetypal.
Yes.
Yeah.
So reflective is sort of your sort of go-to place at the moment, because
I think it sort of feeds into the Ruse thing, which is question everything. And I spent some time and I won't go on about this too long, but looking at Ukraine and actually thinking, where's Putin coming from? And there's this automatic assumption that he's this inherently bad person. But if you look at Russia, it's surrounded by NATO.
Yeah.
And NATO says a really good idea, lads. Let's get more and more people in and get closer and closer. And so if I think I was over where he is, I'd be sort of getting fairly antsy as well.
Yeah.
Now, the way that we've dealt with that, and the way we've dealt with the dialogue or lack of it, or triumphalism following the fall of the wall, actually says we have to put our hands up and actually say, gracious in victory, if victory is what it was.
Yes.
Not so much.
We've been terrible.
For me, there's a real question to ourselves. Notwithstanding, we've got to deal with the situation as it is. It's really easy to cast a villain and make it somebody else's fault.
It is.
Yeah.
And I think we're also ignoring the great invaders of the last 50 years, the Americans.
Yeah. Yeah.
They're the great invaders.
Yeah.
And they haven't been able to come up with a sensible, peaceful dialogue with Putin, which I think is incredibly lacking on their behalf. And of course, we've got our guy here, your guy there, trying to beat China up as well. The rhetoric's appalling.
Yeah.
And so I think it leaves us as leaders in the modern world and endeavoring to build a peaceful planet where nature and people are deeply respected. I think we can use these preferences and ways of living and ways of learning and leading. We can use these to help others to find their own path.
And I think there's a side to it as well, which goes back to sort of Jung and shadow sides, really.
Yes.
Which is, there's a great deal to be had in reflection, but reflection is not going to address the problem. At some point, you're never going to know enough. You've got to make a decision and do something based on what you believe, with what you know, where you are.
It's part of why I put interactive straight after reflective.
Yeah.
I did think a lot about that over the time. So, Liviu, what's coming up for you with these preferences?
I think we are, or at least I have been using all of them. If I am to choose the top ones, it would be musical, reflective, visual, and language. And if I am to choose between the top four, it would be musical and reflective. And I was a bit surprised by this.
Right.
Because I wouldn't expect, I didn't expect musical to be so high. But if I think about it, it's about emotions. And emotions are not just they include not just the, let's say, lower normal human emotions, but they also include the higher emotions, which connect us to, let's say, the divine, through which we then get higher intuitions and access to information that we may not access otherwise. And I think, from my perspective, musical and reflective go hand in hand.
Yes. Yes, I put logical in between the two for reasons that I don't quite know, but I thought that was the right place. I thought I wanted to put a bit of logic between it. But because I'm a musical person and have been a musical person since I was, I played. My parents gave me my first guitar at 12, so I've been involved in music for most of my life. And when I reflected on it, and interestingly, I haven't played a lot. My kids bought me a beautiful instrument for my 50th birthday, so 18 years ago. And I haven't played much, but since I've been recovering from my health challenges, I've started to play again, and my voice came back. I'd lost it for some time now. It's back in a different way, but it's kind of unique. And I've been playing with that a bit, and so I've started playing again recently. And what struck me. And this came from a wonderful book called The Element. You would know Sir Ken Robinson.
Yeah.
One of the great storytellers I've ever witnessed. He and Benjamin Zand are probably my two favorite storytellers. But there's one great story that he talks about it in the book, but I think it's also one of the TED Talks where there's a girl who they think's got ADHD problems, and they actually leave her in a room and they put the music on and they observe, and the psychologist said she hasn't got ADHD, she just wants to be a dancer. And he talks about, you know, how no one's tone deaf. And Benjamin Zander talks about that too. No one's tone deaf. We've all got music in our bones. We all jig to songs, whether we can think we can sing or not. And as I was reflecting on that, I remember, because my parents were both trained singers. I chose not to be to go down the training path. I went the natural path, but I had, you know, was in my genes. My father was a tenor and my mother was an ultra soprano. So in a group of 1,000 people, you could hear mum above them all. And it's really the only thing I miss about the church. I still do miss the singing. And I love to, I've been in sporting crowds, and, you know, I'm still moved when Liverpool do We'll Never Walk Alone at the football. I don't brag for Liverpool, but every time they do it and I see it, I'm moved by it.
Yeah.
So there's something in our bones, Liviu, about music. We're all musical, whether we think we are or not. It's an archetypal thing, Richard, I reckon.
Yeah.
As
the other thing,
all of these things.
The other thing about music as well is it's based on maths. So if you know, they say that, you know, because you've got the way the scales work and everything, it's all mathematical. So it you know, my son's got sort of very strong maths, but also, you know, strong music ability, which go together.
I'm just going to stop the recording there.